Okay, good morning to all. We are going to start. So I've recalled here what we did last time. So we introduced this kind of deformed partition function, ZL of H, where H was just a collection of vectors in R nu attached to each vertex of the torus TL. And it was defined as the expected value under the product measure mu0 of this, the expansion of minus beta times this deformation of the Hamiltonian, where instead of taking just the square norm of SI of minus Sj, we are adding this Hi minus Hj. Okay. And then what we proved is this Gaussian domination bound, which tells that this function ZL of H is maximized at 0, when H is equal to 0 everywhere. Okay. Then the only thing that remains to be done is the proof of the infrared bound, which I have recalled here. It's just stating the following. So for any P which is in the reciprocal torus and P different from 0, we have the identity which is written here that I will not read, right? But so now what we are going to do is to show that this is indeed the case. So proof of the infrared bound, which is a theorem 1024. And the basic, so as I said already last time, so this Gaussian domination bound, which is here, is a kind of integral version of this infrared bound, and we will see now in what sense. So I'm going to use this Gaussian domination to obtain some relations. So we have seen from the Gaussian domination, we know that the function that to lambda associates ZL of lambda h, so lambda is just a real number. This function is maximized at lambda equals 0 for fixed h. Okay. We fix some h in R nu to the torus. Okay. Then we look at that as a function of a real number lambda, and this is maximized at lambda equals 0 because of this identity that we proved last week. Okay. So this means immediately that first we have that the derivative with respect to lambda of ZL of lambda h at lambda equals 0, it has to be equal to 0 because it's a critical point, but it's not only a critical point, it's actually a maximum. So we also know that the second derivative with respect to lambda of ZL of lambda h at lambda equals 0 is actually negative. Okay. And the first inequality is, the first identity is not giving you anything of interest, but the second one is essentially equivalent to this infrared bound. And that's what I'm going to show. Right? We have to work a little bit, but it's essentially equivalent. So the first step is to compute explicitly what this second derivative is. And I will write the answer. So I will try to do it here. I hope I have enough space. Or maybe it's too risky. Let me do it here. So I'm just computing the second derivative, so it's just algebra, so I will not do it here. I just write down the result that you get if you make the computation, lambda h at lambda equals 0. So this is given by a sum of two terms. The first term is 4 beta square times the expected value of the modulus of the, so you sum over all edges in the lattice, Si minus Sj, scalar product Hi minus Hj, modulus square. Then this you multiply inside the expectation by exponential of minus beta, sum over all edges in the lattice, in the torus, of Si minus Sj L2 norm square. I close and then take the expectation with respect to mu0. So that's the first term you get when you compute the derivative of this quantity here. And then the second term you get is minus 2 beta, sum over all ij in edges in the torus, the L2 norm of Hi minus Hj which must multiply the expected value of exponential of minus beta, sum over all edges in the torus of the L2 norm Fsi minus Sj. Sj square. And again, the expected value is with respect to the product measure mu0. Okay, so it's not a difficult computation. Just compute the derivative. You put lambda equals 0 and you get that. Okay. Now this, so we know from start that this quantity is smaller or equal to 0. So this is smaller or equal to 0. And this we can rewrite as this term being smaller than this one. And then we can divide by this expectation value on both sides. And if you do that, this you recognize here exactly the partition function of the model. It's the expected value with respect to the product measure of exponential of minus the Hamiltonian. So it's just the partition function. So when we divide by this partition function on both sides, I'm creating here an expectation with respect to the Gibbs measure mu L. So that's what you get. So if you do that, you arrive finally to the following inequality, which is that the expected value of the modulus of the sum over all ij edges in the torus of Si minus Sj scalar product Hi minus Hj modulus square. Now we take the expected value with respect to the Gibbs measure mu L. This is smaller, maybe I have enough space here, smaller than 1 over 2 beta, which just come from this 2 beta divided by 4 beta square, sum over all ij in the edges in the torus of Hi minus Hj L2 norm square. And that's true for any h in R nu to the torus. Okay, so that's the inequality that you get. This is just a reformulation of this, the fact that you have a maximum at h equals 0 of this different partition function. So that's exactly what you get. Okay. And now I claim that this is nothing but the infrared bound, although it might not be completely apparent at the moment, but you will see. Of course, h are completely free here. There are no h in the infrared bound. So I can play with h. I can choose h in a suitable way, and that's what I'm going to do. But the first observation is that before I choose h, is that this, which is true for any h in R nu to the torus, it still holds, for trivial reasons, for all h in C nu to the torus. And that just comes from the fact that both the modulus square here and the L2 norm square here, when you take an h which is complex, the imaginary and real parts will just split into two terms. You will get a sum, a square of the real part plus a square of the imaginary part. Same on this side. And therefore, you can apply this inequality both to the real part and to the imaginary part and deduce the corresponding inequality for complex valued h's. Okay, and this is what I'm going to choose. I'm going to choose some plane wave for h, so it will be convenient to have this observation.
I'm sorry, what did happen with this term?
This? Yeah. I've divided on both sides. So this is just, this term here is just the partition function ZL of the measure, so of the Gibbs measure. So when I divide, so on this side it disappears, and on this side I'm dividing this by the partition function, and this gives me the expectation of this with respect to the Gibbs measure instead of this. So this is just exponential of minus h, and then I divide by partition function. So this is exponential of minus h divided by z, which is just the probability of a configuration under the Gibbs measure, right? And then I get that. So the big difference is that here you had the mu naught, and now you have mu L. If you want, I can write it this way. It's a Gibbs measure. Okay. So now, let's fix some p in the reciprocal torus. And let's fix some direction L in R nu, so 1 up to nu. Okay. And let's choose, so set, I will choose now the value of h that I want to take, so the profile h that I want to take, and I will do it this way. So first, I will set for any j in the lattice, I will set alpha j is equal to e I p times j, and then I will set hj to be equal to alpha j times the unit vector in direction L in R nu. Okay? All the hj's are vectors in R nu, and I chose them to be all along the L's coordinate axis for simplicity, where I have a fixed sum L. And then the norm of hj is given by, I mean, the norm. The component of hj along this L's coordinate axis is just given by this plane wave EIPJ. Okay? That's a choice that I make for hj, and this turns out to be the good one. So this is just the L's vector in the canonical basis. Canonical basis of R nu. Okay, so now we have to rewrite this. I want to compute explicitly the left-hand side and the right-hand side when I substitute h, the general values of h here, by the specific values that I'm choosing here. And to do that, I'm going to use, again, what we used already many times, which are these discrete green identities, especially this discrete green identity 1 that I introduced in the chapter on the Gaussian free field. Turns out that this still holds in the present context with the same proof, exactly the same proof that we did for the lattice. It still holds on the torus, but it's actually simpler here, because since you are in the torus, there are no boundary terms. Because there is no boundary. Okay? So I'm going to apply this discrete green identity, and we will see that this will lead us to this infrared bound after a few computations. Okay, so I'm starting with the simpler one, which is the right-hand side here, so the sum over hi minus hj square. So let's try to rewrite that. So it's sum over all edges in the torus, L2 norm of hi minus hj square. So this is just the sum over all ij in the torus, just write ij, of so hi minus hj are both vectors along the L's component, the L's coordinate axis of R nu. So you just have to take, say, alpha j is just alpha j minus alpha I modulus square. Okay. But this I can, of course, rewrite as sum over ij of gradient alpha complex conjugate ij gradient alpha ij. Okay. This is just elementary identities, and now I'm using this discrete green identity. So here I'm using this dg1 for the torus, which gives you, say, the sum over all vertices in the torus. This guy, so alpha bar evaluated at I, and then I get minus Laplacian alpha evaluated at I. And there are no boundary terms, as I said, because there is no boundary in the torus. So you just get this. Okay. So now the only thing we have to do to complete this computation is to compute what the Laplacian of alpha is. So let's compute the Laplacian of alpha. I will maybe do it here, and then I will complete the computation on this side. Okay, so let's compute minus Laplacian alpha at I, where I'm going to use the specific form of alpha, which is this EIPJ. Right? So this, by definition, is the sum over all j neighboring I of alpha, there is a minus, so it will be alpha I minus alpha j. Okay. Now I'm just substituting alpha by its definition, so it will be EIP times I, sum over j neighboring I, 1 minus EIP j minus I. Okay. Not done anything, just substituted by their definitions, and I'm taking out alpha I, which is EIP I. Okay. So I'm just getting this. Okay. Then I can okay, let's look at both terms. So the first, the sum over 1 will just give me 2D. So I will get 2D E I P I, which will multiply 1 minus 1 over 2D, sum over all j neighboring I, E I P j minus I. Not done anything special here. And now, observe that when I'm summing over all neighbors of I, I'm taking all the time some, or maybe I can do it in 2 steps, so maybe it's easier if I explain it like that. So first, this is the same, because the only thing that appears here in the summand is j minus I. This is the same as summing over all, say, k neighboring 0, E, I, P, scalar product with k. And then here it's easier to see. So when I'm taking some values of k, some neighbor k of 0, and I'm also taking the neighbor minus k of 0, and I'm summing their contribution, the imaginary part of this guy, so the sign part of this guy, since it's odd, it disappears. So the only thing that remains is the sum over all k neighboring 0 of cosine of pk, p times k. And the sign part vanishes because it's an odd function. Okay, so that's what remains. So that's exactly what we want. So now you can inject this expression for the minus Laplacian of alpha inside this expression. So what you get is sum over all, maybe let's have some room. So sum over all I in the torus. Alpha bar I, so alpha bar I is E minus I P I. Then we get the expression which is here, so we get 2D, E, I, P, scalar product I, and then we get 1 minus 1 over 2D, sum over all k neighboring 0, cosine of P times P scalar product k. Okay, we arrive at this expression, and you see that the EIPI just cancel, and you're left with this particular expression. So you're left with 2D sum over I. So this, nothing depends on I here. So, okay, the sum is over I, but all the dependence in I has cancelled. So, and nothing depends on I, so the sum over I just gives me the size of the torus. Let me write it this way, it will be more convenient. And then I get 1 minus 1 over 2D, sum over k neighboring 0, cosine pk. Okay, so that's what we get for the right-hand side in the inequality, which is up there. So now let's do exactly the same for the left-hand side. Maybe I keep this for a while because I will need this formula for the Laplacian again. I'll try to do everything on this board. So let's start with this side now. So we have, let's start first with what is inside. So sum over all ij in edges in the torus of Si minus Sj, scalar product Hi minus Hj. Okay. So this, of course, I can write as the sum over all edges in the torus of, again, so Hi and Hj are just along the else coordinate axis. So when I take, so I can factor out, if you want, the vector, the basis vector EL, and I will take the scalar product with this. This will give me the else component of Si minus the else component of Sj. So I will get something like gradient of SL ij times gradient alpha ij. Okay, that's what you get. This will give you alpha I minus alpha j times EL. EL times the scalar product this will give me the else component of S. And the difference of the else component gives me the gradient. Okay, that's exactly what I have. So SL, I already used this last time, but SL here is really, say at I, it's SI times EL. So it's the else component of the spin. Okay. Okay, but now once I'm here, I'm again using discrete green identity. So this by discrete green identity is just the sum over all I in the torus TL of SLI times minus Laplacian alpha at I. Okay. But minus Laplacian alpha, we have just computed it here. So I can just substitute. So I get, okay, sum over all. Maybe I take the 2D out. Let me take everything that does not depend on I outside. So the 2D does not depend on I. And then 1 minus this stuff does not depend on I. So 1 minus 1 over 2D. Sum over all k neighboring 0 cosine of P scalar product k. Okay. And then I have the sum over I in the torus of SIL times EIPL, okay, which comes PI, sorry, EIPI, which is here. Okay, so that's what we get if we inject the computation we've made for the Laplacian of alpha, minus Laplacian of alpha. So we get this. That's not exactly what we want. We want the modulus square of this, so I have to take the modulus square on both sides. So what you get is that, and let's take also the expected value. So the expected value of the modulus square of this sum, Si minus Sj, scalar product Hi minus Sj, modulus square, and expected value with respect to the Gibbs measure mu L. Okay. This, by the computation we have just made, is the same thing as 4d square, the square of this bracket here, so 1 minus 1 over 2d, sum over k neighboring 0, cosine pk square. Okay. And then I get the square of this thing, so I get the modulus square of sum over I in TL, SIL, EIP scalar product I, modulus square. And the expected value, sorry. And the only thing that is random here, all this are just numbers, just constant. The only thing which is random is the random variable Si, so the expected value is only acting here, mu L. Okay. So that's what we get for the left-hand side of this inequality that we derived earlier. Okay, so now I can rewrite this inequality explicitly in terms of what the expression I obtained here and there, okay, and see whether it gives me what I want. So I will do it here because I don't need this formula for the Laplacian anymore, I think. So that we keep both expressions on the board for a little while. So the inequality up there is telling us that this guy is smaller than this guy. So let me write it down. So we get that, say, this expected value here, I will divide by everything else. So the expected value of the modulus square of the sum over all I, it was I, in the torus of S, L, I, E, IP scalar product I, modulus square, expected value with respect to the Gibbs measure, so that's just the expected value which was here, then this has to be smaller than what we computed before here, divided by this prefactor. Okay? So when I divide by the prefactor, so this will be smaller. So when I divide by the prefactor, I get 2d over 4d squared, which will give me, let me do it here, which will give me 1 over 2d. There is an additional constant that I'm forgetting, because don't forget that here I have a 1 over 2 beta that I've not yet taken into account. So I also get a 2 beta here. Times 2 beta. Okay. Then I have this torus, which is still there. So the torus is there. Then I get this 1 minus 1 over 2d sum of the cosine. But I'm dividing by 1 minus 1 over 2d sum of the cosine square. So I will just get 1 minus 1 over 2d sum of the cosine to the power minus 1. Okay. And then what remains is just what am I? I think it's done, right? I've taken everything. I don't think I've forgotten anything. So that's where we are. Okay. And what we get here starts looking like the infrared bound. We have to just rewrite a little bit this expectation. So let me look at this expectation. So we have that the expectation of sum over all I in TL, SIL, E, I, P scalar product I, modulo square under mu L. I can again expand the square, as we did many times. If I do that, what do I get? So I get the sum over all I and J in the torus, pairs of vertices in the torus. And then I will get E, I, P scalar product J minus I. And then I will get the expected value of SI, L, S, J, L, under mu L. Okay, I've just expanded the square here. I get this. And now, as we did last time, we use the fact that the measure on the torus is obviously translation invariant, because making a translation on the torus is just changing the labels of the vertices. Does not change anything, doesn't change the measure. So this is just equal to S0 L Sj minus I L under mu L by translation invariance. Okay. So this means that this expression is actually equal to the sum over all I in the torus then I have the sum over all j in the torus, ei p j minus I, expected value of S0L, Sj minus I L under mu L. Okay. Everything depends only on j minus I, so I can replace the sum over j as a sum over j minus I. So this will be sum over I in TL, sum over k in TL, and I will get ei p scalar product k, S0L, Sk, the L should be there, SKL, under mu L. Okay. So you see that this does not depend on I, so the sum over I just gives you the size of the torus, and then we are done. TL, E, I, Pk, S0L, SKL, mu L. So I claim that we are done. The only thing that remains to be done is that in the formulation of the infrared bound, what I have on the left-hand side is not something that involves the product of the L's component of S0 and Sk, but the scalar product of S0 and Sk, but I can recover it by summing over L now. So let's sum over L. And this will be the last line I will write on this infrared bound. Okay, so let's sum over L. So if I want to have the sum over all k in TL, EI, PK, S0 scalar product Sk, which is what I really want, under mu L. This is just the sum for L equal 1 to nu of sum over k in the torus, E, I, pk, S0L, SKL, mu L. Okay. And then I can use this inequality here, so it will be smaller or equal, so I have the sum over L from 1 to nu of 1 over, say, 4d beta, which is here, and the TL, which is here, cancel with the TL, which is there. It disappears, and I'm left with 1 minus 1 over 2d, sum over k neighboring 0, cosine pk, p scalar product k, to the power minus 1. Okay, but now nothing depends on L on this side, so this just gives me, I can remove the sum over L and just put a nu here. It's just the same thing. And that's exactly the infrared bound. Okay. So this concludes the proof of the infrared bound and of this chapter on reflection positivity. So in the remaining 1 hour of class that we have, what I would like to do is to give you one of the existing proofs of the FKG inequality for the Ising model. I'm not giving you the shortest one, so you can find it in the book. There is a very short, very general one in the book, but one which is for me completely magical. You don't understand what is going on. So instead, I'm going to give you another proof that I find it's a bit longer. It's probably a bit less general if you try to see how far it brings you. Probably it's less general than the other one, but it's much more enlightening as to why the FKG inequality must be true in the Ising model. Okay, so I will explain this one. And I think that's the last thing I will do in this class. So in the book, it's 3.10.3. It's an alternative proof of the FKG inequality, the title of the section in the book, because I'm giving the short one first. So proof of FKG for Ising. The approach I'm taking is not depending very much on the fact that it's the Ising model, but I will still focus only on the Ising model. Okay, and this is done in several steps. And each of them is somehow interesting and teaches you something if you didn't already know it before. So the first thing is about what is known as the Gibbs sampler. It's, if you want, you can see it as an algorithm to sample approximatively from a Gibbs measure using Markov chains. Okay, and I want to explain how this works because the proof will rely on this algorithm, actually on the Markov chain that you use in this algorithm. So let's take a finite subset of ZD, which I call lambda as usual. Okay. Let's take mu, a probability measure on the configuration, so omega lambda, which is just minus 1,1 to the power lambda. Okay. And I'm assuming that, say such that, mu of omega is strictly positive for all configurations, omega and omega lambda. It's obviously true for a Gibbs measure because the Gibbs measure, the probability is proportional to exponential of minus the energy, and the energy is finite, so the exponential is strictly positive. Okay, but here at the moment I'm dealing with an arbitrary probability measure on omega lambda, which is positive everywhere. Okay, then I want to sample from mu. So I want to construct a Markov chain that allows me to sample from mu. So a Markov chain that will have mu as its stationary distribution, as its unique stationary distribution. So this is done as follows. So we construct a Markov chain Xn on omega lambda. So the state of the Markov chains are configuration of the configuration of the system, so configuration in lambda, in the following way. So to describe the Markov chain, I have to tell you how to go from the state at time n to the state at time n plus 1. So assume that the state at time n is given by some configuration omega. So given that xn is equal to omega, which is the configuration omega lambda, we set xn plus 1 equal to omega prime in omega lambda using the following recipe. Okay. So the first thing I'm doing is that I'm sampling at random a real number between 0 and 1 uniformly. So sample u in 0, 1 uniformly. All my sampling are independent from each other, and I will not say it explicitly. Okay, it's the obvious assumption. So sample u uniformly at random. Sample a vertex of lambda uniformly at random. So I call it I. So sample I in lambda uniformly among all possible vertices of lambda. And then what you do, this omega prime that I want to construct, this new state of the chain at time n plus 1, given that the state at time n was omega, I define it as follows. So I set omega prime j to be equal to omega j for all j different from I. So in one time step, the only thing that I'm changing is the spin at one vertex, the vertex I. All the others are left unchanged. And the way I'm changing the spin at vertex I is as follows. So I set omega prime I to be equal to plus 1 if the number u that I've sampled before is smaller or equal the probability of observing a plus 1 at I, given that I'm observing omega everywhere else. So sigma j is equal to omega j for all j different from I. Okay? If this is true, then I'm putting a 1, otherwise I'm putting a minus 1. Okay? So the idea is extremely simple. So you take a configuration, think of the Ising model, take a configuration of the Ising model, then you sample a vertex at random, and then conditionally on what you see outside this spin, or conditionally on the state of all the other spin, I'm replaying this spin. So I'm resampling this spin at random according to the Gibbs measure, and it falls with some probability in the state plus 1 and some probability in the state minus 1. This is exactly what we are doing here. Okay. So that defines you the transition probability of the Markov chains. I will just summarize them now. Hopla. Okay, so to summarize, so in other words, the transition probability of the state, probability of going from a configuration omega to a configuration omega prime for this Markov chain, is given by 0 if the configuration omega and omega prime differ at more than one vertex. At most one side of the box where the mass differ. And if they differ at most in one vertex, then the probability will be given by mu sigma I is equal to omega prime I, given sigma j is equal to omega j for all j different from I. It's just a reformulation of what we have written there. Check the equivalence very easily. And this probability, we can write it in a bit nicer way. So this is nothing but so you see in the numerator, it's a conditional probability, so I can look at probability in the numerator and probability in the denominator. In the numerator, I have omega everywhere, which is the same as omega prime, everywhere outside I. And then I'm imposing omega prime I at the vertex I. So in the numerator, I just have mu of omega prime, probability of observing omega prime. And the denominator have all possibilities, which are just two possibilities, because all the spins have to be equal to omega outside I, and at I, either it's equal to omega prime, or it's equal to the value that it had before, which was omega. So you get mu of omega prime plus mu of omega. Okay, so that's the expression you get for this conditional probability. Okay, so that's when they differ at, okay, when omega and omega prime differ at one vertex, exactly. At exactly one vertex. And the remaining probability is when they don't differ, so you just get omega prime equal omega. Okay, so that's about this Markov chain. It's very easy to check that this Markov chain Xn is irreducible and aperiodic. It's irreducible because I can go from any configuration to any other configuration by flipping one spin at a time, and transition from one configuration to another configuration that differ from it by just one spin is strictly positive. The probability of going from one to the other is strictly positive, so I get a product of strictly positive numbers. This is strictly positive. So it's irreducible. I can go from any configuration to any configuration with positive probability in a sufficiently large number of steps. It's aperiodic because you have a strictly positive probability of going from one configuration to itself. Okay, so these are two things that are given for free, and from this it immediately follows that let's say the law of Xn converges to the unique stationary distribution of the chain. Stationary distribution. That's for free from the theory of finite state Markov chains. It turns out that this unique stationary distribution is actually the measure mu that we started with. So indeed, this Markov chain will give us a way of sampling from mu by just running the Markov chain for a sufficiently large time. So the claim is mu is this unique stationary distribution of the chain. And it's very easy to check because in fact the Markov chain Xn is reversible with respect to mu. Is reversible with respect to mu. Indeed, if you take any pairs of configuration omega and omega prime differing at exactly one vertex, then mu of omega times the probability of going from omega to omega prime. This is given by what? Well, we have just computed the probability of going from omega to omega prime when the two configurations differ at one vertex is given by this ratio. I multiply it by mu omega, so it's mu omega prime, divided by mu of omega plus mu omega prime. But this is symmetric in omega and omega prime, so this is also equal to mu of omega prime times the probability that you go from omega prime to omega. Okay. So it's a reverse. So the measure mu is reversible with respect to the Markov chain. So it's giving the unique stationary distribution of the chain. Okay. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. So we have constructed this Markov chain that converges to our measure mu. Yes, thank you. Sure. Because I'm choosing I. Yes, I'm choosing I uniformly, so I have the probability of choosing one particular I. Where should I put it? I should put it here. And therefore also there. And therefore also, I guess, one more place, which must be there. Yes, thank you. Sure. This does not change the fact that it's symmetric in omega and omega prime. Okay. So, okay. So then the next stage So the first was this Gibbs sampler. The next stage, oh, maybe it's time to make the break. So we make the break, and then I explain what is the second stage in the construction. Okay, we'll resume. So in the previous part of the argument, what we did, we started with a probability measure on a set of configuration in the box lambda, and we constructed a Markov chain whose distribution converges as times run to infinity to the distribution we started with, so this measure mu we started with. So now I want to take two measure mu and mu tilde, the corresponding Markov chains xn and xn tilde, and to couple them in a way that will be useful for us. So the second stage is so-called monotone coupling. Monotone coupling. So let mu and mu tilde be two probability measures on omega lambda as before, and I'm assuming now that two things. So first, mu of omega and mu tilde of omega is strictly positive for all omega, which will always be true for us. And then the important assumption is that I'm assuming that the probability of observing a 1 under the measure mu, the probability of observing a 1 at a vertex I, given that I'm observing some configuration omega outside, this is always smaller than the corresponding probability under mu tilde, probability of observing a 1 at I under mu tilde, given that outside I, I'm observing some configuration omega tilde. And I want this to be true, well, of course, for all I in lambda, but also for all omega in omega tilde in omega lambda, such that omega tilde is larger or equal omega. Okay? So I'm taking two configurations which are ordered, so omega tilde is at least as large as omega, an arbitrary vertex, and I'm looking at the configuration everywhere outside this vertex. I'm hiding the vertex. I want to compute the probability of seeing a 1 at I under the measure mu, given that I see omega outside, and under the measure mu tilde, given that I see omega tilde outside, and I want the second probability to be bigger than the former probability, the first probability. Okay, so that's the basic assumption in this part on monotone coupling. Now, I have two measures which are exactly of the type we studied in the previous part, so I can assume, I can construct in the same way as before the Markov chain, two Markov chain xn and xn tilde associated to these two measures. So let xn and xn tilde be the corresponding Markov chains, so the associated Markov chain, as explained before. And what I want to do is I want to construct the two chains xn and xn tilde on the same probability space so that I can compare them. So I want to introduce a coupling of the two chains. So we couple xn and xn tilde in a very simple way. What we are going to do, I still have it here, that's very good. So when I'm defining these chains, xn or xn tilde, I'm using an algorithm, which is the algorithm described here. So it starts with two things. The first is that I'm sampling some real number uniformly in 0, 1, and the second is that I'm sampling a vertex of lambda uniformly at random. What I'm going to do is that when I'm constructing xn and xn tilde, I'm going to use the same u and the same I in both constructions. The same value of, so I'm sampling one u that I'm using both to construct xn and xn tilde, and I'm sampling one I that I'm using to construct both xn and xn tilde. So we couple them by using the same u and I in their construction. So at each step of the construction of xn, xn tilde, I'm using the same I and u in their construction. Okay. So if I do that, there is a very nice property that is automatically satisfied, which is that if the Markov chain xn tilde starts at time 0 in a configuration which is larger or equal to the configuration xn starts at time 0, then this order is preserved by the evolution. So xn tilde is bigger than xn for all time. So this will be very convenient. So let me state and prove this. So claim if at some time I have xn tilde greater than xn, these are configuration omega, so it's the order, the usual partial order that we're using when doing FKG. So it's xn tilde at vertex I is bigger than xn at vertex I for all I. So then xn plus 1, x tilde n plus 1 is greater or equal x n plus 1. Okay. So the ordering is preserved. So if at time 0 they start with x tilde bigger than x at time 0, then for all time x tilde is bigger than x. Okay. So this is very easy to check. It's a consequence of our assumption here. So indeed, to have, so I'm assuming that this is true, and then to violate the conclusion, to have xn plus 1 bigger than x tilde n plus 1, I certainly need that the vertex at which I have updated the chain to go from time n to time n plus 1, so the vertex I that I'm using to go from, to update the chain from time n to time n plus 1, ends up with a plus spin in xn plus 1 and a minus spin in x tilde n plus 1. Okay, it's the only possibility, because if I want it to be bigger, the ordering tells you that at all the other vertices they must be equal, and then at this one it has to be bigger. So to have this, we must have sigma I of xn plus 1 is equal to plus 1. Okay. And let me write it explicitly, and sigma I of x tilde n plus 1 equal minus 1, where I is the vertex that is updated at this stage, at these steps, where I is the vertex that is updated at time n plus 1, at this time. Okay. But let's see that this leads to a contradiction immediately. So if I have sigma I of xn plus 1 equal to plus 1, this means by the way we construct the chain, it's not on the board, well, we can read it more or less from there, but it implies that this number u that we have used to construct the chain has to be smaller to set the spin at I to the value plus 1. I had to have u smaller than mu of sigma I equal plus 1, given sigma j is equal to, let's say, sigma j of xn for all j different from I. Okay. So given the state at xn of all the other spins, the probability that I put a plus 1 at vertex I gives me must be an upper bound for u. Okay, that's the way we define the chain, okay, the transition probabilities. So this must be true. But this implies immediately that u must also be smaller than mu tilde, sigma I is equal to plus 1, given that sigma j is equal to sigma j of xn tilde for all j different from I. Why? Well, first, xn tilde by assumption is larger or equal to xn. Okay, at time n, I'm assuming that xn tilde is larger or equal xn. So the configuration I'm seeing outside I is bigger here than it is here. Now I'm using the measure mu tilde and here the measure mu, so I'm exactly in this setting. So I have a configuration omega tilde which is bigger than omega, and then the probability under mu tilde of seeing a plus 1 at vertex I must be bigger than the probability under mu of single plus 1 at vertex I. So if u is smaller than this, since this is smaller than this, u must also be smaller than that. But if u is smaller than that, that means that at this stage, I've set sigma I, the spin at x tilde, in configuration x tilde n plus 1, the spin at I must also be set to plus 1. Because it's set to plus 1 every time the u I'm using is smaller than the corresponding conditional probability. Okay. So this means that if this spin is plus 1, this spin is plus 1, which contradicts the fact that it should be minus 1. Okay, so I get a contradiction. Okay. So this proves this claim. So the ordering is preserved all the time by this coupling. So let me denote by P, denote by P the joint distribution of the two Markov chain. Xn and Xn tilde. Okay. So from this simple coupling, we can now easily prove that to measure mu and mu tilde, which have these properties, satisfy some condition that is known as stochastic domination. So I want to discuss stochastic domination. Stochastic domination. So we take mu and mu tilde as above, so with all the assumptions that we made before. Okay. In particular, this assumption. Then let's say, let me give you a definition, then we'll show that this definition actually holds in our, that the corresponding claim holds in our case. So we say that mu tilde dominates, okay, stochastically dominates. Stochastically dominates mu if we have the following. So we want the expected value of f under mu is smaller than the expected value of f under mu tilde for all increasing function f. Say non-decreasing. Decreasing function f. Okay. So in non-decreasing function, I have higher expectation under mu tilde than under mu, and then we say that mu tilde dominates mu stochastically. Okay. So let's see that under our assumptions, under this assumption that allowed us to construct this monotone coupling between the two Markov chains, we automatically have that mu tilde stochastically dominates mu. So claim mu tilde stochastically dominates mu. Okay. So to do that, I have to check that this inequality holds for any non-decreasing function f. So let's fix such a function f. So let f be non-decreasing. Okay. And then let's compute the expected value of f under mu tilde minus the expected value of f. Maybe let me do it in two stages. So the expected value of f, one way of computing it is to take my Markov chain. So, okay, at some point I have to, okay, let me maybe say it here before going to that. So I will denote as before these two chains, xn, xn tilde, which have been coupled with this monotone coupling, coupled Markov chains that we have discussed before. Okay? And now I'm assuming something about the initial state, otherwise I cannot compare them. So I have to be sure that you start with a smaller configuration for xn than for xn tilde. So such that I'm assuming that x0 is equal to the configuration which has minuses everywhere. Remember, I don't know if you remember the notation. So eta minuses was the configuration that was equal to -1 everywhere. So eta plus or minuses is equal to plus or -1 everywhere. Okay. And x tilde 0 is equal to the configuration which is equal to plus everywhere. So in particular, it's clear that at time 0, the configuration x tilde is bigger than the configuration x. Okay, so you start at a higher state. So by what we saw before, we know that xn tilde is bigger than xn at each time. Okay, so that's what I want to use here. So let n go to infinity. One way of computing this expectation, or maybe I can, let me do it really slowly. I don't know how familiar you are with all these things. So eta tilde is in omega lambda. First, just the definition. So this is f of eta tilde. And then I want the probability mu tilde of eta tilde. Okay, that's just the definition of the expectation. But now, what I can do is, I know that mu tilde is the stationary distribution of the chain. So this I can get as a limit, as n goes to infinity, of the probability that the chain xn tilde is equal to eta tilde. Okay. As time goes to infinity, the probability of observing the chain is in some given configuration converges to mu tilde. Okay. So this means that this is just the limit as n goes to infinity, sum eta tilde in omega lambda, f of eta tilde, p of xn tilde is equal to eta tilde. So I can replace the measure mu tilde. I have to take a limit, but I can replace the measure mu tilde with by the probability associated to the Markov chain. And now I can, of course, do the same for the expectation under mu, and I get the limit as n goes to infinity, sum over all eta in omega lambda, f of eta, probability that xn is equal to eta, for the same reason. Okay. Probability of the distribution of xn converges to mu, so I can compute the expected value using this. Okay. Now, the next observation is that I'm interested in the difference between in the expectation of f under mu tilde minus the expectation of f under mu. Okay, I want to show that this is positive, non-negative. So I would like to be able to compare, to subtract, if you want, these two expressions in a convenient way. So one way to do that is to add here in the sum. I can add, if I want, a sum over eta in omega lambda. Okay, I'm adding a second sum, and then I'm adding here xn is equal to eta. Summing over all possible values of eta, this probability just gives me 1, so this does not change anything, right? I can certainly do that, and I can do the same here. I'm also summing over eta tilde in omega lambda, and I'm adding xn tilde is equal to eta tilde. It doesn't change anything because I'm summing over all possibilities. Okay. Now, if I do that, it's very easy to express the difference of expectations. If I do that, then I get the limit, maybe I do it here, limit as n goes to infinity, sum over eta in eta tilde in omega lambda, f of eta tilde minus f of eta times the probability of observing eta as a configuration for the Markov chain xn and eta tilde for the Markov chain xn tilde. Okay, that's what you get for the difference. And now we are going to use the fact that x and x tilde are coupled using this monotone coupling that I discussed before. This tells you that since x tilde started in a configuration that was higher than the starting configuration of x, this order is preserved all the time, so this probability is equal to 0 if eta tilde is smaller than eta. It's not possible that x tilde, the chain x tilde, takes a smaller value than the chain x. We prove that this is not possible. So this is 0 if this inequality is satisfied. But that means that this expression that we have, we can write it as the limit as n goes to infinity. Sum over all eta tilde, in omega lambda, such that eta tilde is greater or equal to eta. I can put this constraint that eta tilde is greater or equal to eta, otherwise it's 0 in any case. F of eta tilde minus f of eta times the probability that xn is eta and xn tilde is eta tilde. Okay, not done anything special, but now it's over because if eta tilde is larger than eta, f of eta tilde is larger than f of eta because f is non-decreasing. So this is greater or equal 0. This is a probability, so everything is non-negative, so you get that this is greater or equal 0. Okay. So this proves that indeed mu tilde stochastically dominates mu. So all this is very nice, but what has it to do with the FKG inequality? So let me now turn to the final step of the proof. Everything we've done up to now is completely general, or can be generalized at least to basically any situation. So last step, this I've done, this one. So it's proof of the FKG inequality. Okay. So now I'm assuming that I have the Ising model on ZD. It's not very important. Let's assume it. Take as before lambda finite subset of ZD. Eta, which will be a boundary condition now. Okay, in an infinite configuration that I will use as a boundary condition. Take beta to be a non-negative inverse temperature and h an arbitrary real number. So all the parameters I need, all the objects I need to define the Gibbs measure for my Ising model. Okay, so now what we want to show is the FKG inequality. So we want to show that the expected value of Fg under the Gibbs measure is greater or equal to the expected value of F times the expected value of G. And that has to be true for any, say, Fg with support inside lambda without loss of generality, such that, okay, Fg non-decreasing, and such that support of F and support of G are inside lambda. Okay, it's enough to do this, because outside it's fixed to the boundary condition, so you can see the restriction of the function given that the configuration is frozen outside the box lambda as a function which is defined inside lambda. So there is no loss of generality in doing that, so that's what we want to prove. So that's FKG. We want to prove that. One thing that we can do also without loss of generality, and which will be very convenient for us, is to assume that G of omega is greater or equal 0 for all omega. Actually, I can even take it strictly bigger than 0 for all omega in omega. Okay. Why can we do that? Well, G is a local function, so it takes only finitely many values. That means that I can always add a constant to G to make it strictly positive. Okay, so let me write things. So G local implies takes finitely many values. Okay. Then I can. Okay. That means that we can add. So there exists C in R, such that G plus C, so G of omega, plus the constant is strictly positive for all omega. Okay, I'm writing very badly. G of omega plus C is strictly positive for all omega. Okay. But adding a constant does not affect the covariance. Adding a constant to C to G does not change the covariance. Between F and G. Okay, that's the only observation that we have to make. So if I'm adding a constant C here to G, and I'm adding the same constant C, of course, here, then you can see that the effect of C cancels on both sides. So it doesn't change anything. So I can always shift my function G so that it takes only strictly positive values everywhere. So I'm doing that because I want to use G to construct a new probability measure. So it's better if it's strictly positive. Okay, so the conclusion is near now. So let me introduce two measures, mu and mu tilde, which will have the properties that we assumed earlier. Okay, so I'm constructing two. So define two probability measures on omega lambda in the following way. So mu is just defined as, so mu of omega. So omega is an element of omega lambda, so it's a configuration restricted to the finite box. This is defined as the probability under the Gibbs measure that we are considering of the infinite configuration which is given by omega inside the box lambda and eta outside. Let me just write it like that. So omega eta will just be, it's a configuration which is equal by definition to omega I if I is in lambda and to eta I if I is not in lambda. Okay. Using this. So that's just I'm extending omega, which is defined only in the finite box, with the boundary condition. I'm looking at the property of this configuration under the Gibbs measure. And then for mu tilde, I'm doing something completely similar. Maybe I'll write it here. So for mu tilde, I'm defining the probability of observing omega, where it starts the same way. So it will be mu beta h of configuration omega eta. It's the same as before up to now. But now I'm going to take a density with respect to this measure, and this density will be given by the function g. Okay, so I've fixed the function g like that, and then I take g of omega eta, and I want this to be properly normalized. I want this to be a probability measure, so I divide by the expected value of g under the Gibbs measure. Okay, you can check that this is properly normalized. It's trivial because, okay, it's trivial. And this defines me a probability measure on omega lambda. So now I have two probability measures. Obviously, they are strictly positive. So this is strictly positive for all omega in omega lambda, and this is also strictly positive for all omega in omega lambda. Okay. Good. This because it's a Gibbs measure, and this because it's a Gibbs measure, and G is supposed to be strictly positive. Okay. So we are more or less in the setting we had before. So now the next thing is that using these two measures, mu and mu tilde, I can rewrite this FKG inequality. So FKG can now be seen to be equivalent to the following statement. I want the expected value. So, okay, let me write it like that. Of f under mu tilde has to be bigger than the expected value of f under mu. So for all f, say, omega lambda to r, non-decreasing. Okay. G is fixed. G is a non-decreasing function which has these properties. Okay. So that's what we want. Why? Well, if you just write this, I mean, it's probably obvious, okay? But if you just write this using this measure, this will give you, okay, let me write it. So what is this? It's just the sum overall configuration omega of f of omega mu tilde of omega, but mu tilde of omega is g of omega. Okay, g of omega. Okay, we should extend it to. Let's forget about the extension, which is trivial. Mu eta lambda beta h of omega eta, okay, divided by, all this is divided by the expected value of g, lambda beta h eta. So you see that what I get is exactly the expected value of fg under the Gibbs measure divided by the expected value of g under the Gibbs measure. So this expected value of f under mu tilde is just the expected value of fg divided by the expected value of g. So if I have that this is bigger than that, I have that the expected value of the product fg is bigger than the product of the expected values, right? Just so it's trivial that fkg is equivalent to that. So that's nice because you see that this inequality that for any non-decreasing function f, I have that its expectation under mu tilde is larger than its expectation under mu is exactly the kind of property that we had before to prove that, it's enough to prove that mu tilde stochastically dominates mu. Okay, that's what we did just before. But we have a sufficient condition for a measure mu tilde to stochastically dominate a measure mu. That's the condition we derived earlier, which is maybe still on the board, but I don't think so. No, it was this. Okay, but I will write it down. Let me write it down. It is, okay, we have seen that it is sufficient to prove that the following is true. So we want that mu, the probability under mu of seeing a +1 at I given that I see some configuration omega j outside I. This has to be smaller than mu tilde, sigma I equal +1, given that sigma j is equal to omega tilde j for all j different from I. And this we have to check for all I in lambda, for all omega tilde configurations with omega tilde larger or equal omega. Okay, that's what we saw before. If we have this property between of the two measures mu and mu tilde, then automatically mu tilde stochastically dominates mu, and therefore fkg is true. Okay, so we have to check this for the measure mu and mu tilde that we have just defined. But it's just a matter of computation now. We just compute explicitly this conditional probability, and we will see that it gives us what we want. You see what you have gained by going through this construction with the Markov chain where you update vertices at one vertex at a time is that you get a conditional probability of what happens at one particular vertex given some boundary condition. And the Gibbs measure at one vertex is completely trivial. It's just a function of one variable. And you will be able to write, this will really be something completely explicit that you can check by hand. So that's a very powerful way of proving the FKG inequality, and very natural one. So let me compute this. Maybe I can start here so that I have a bit more room. Let's compute this conditional probability, which is here. I think I have enough space. So mu tilde of sigma I equal +1, given that sigma j is equal to, let's say, some omega tilde j. So I'm fixing omega and omega tilde as here. So fix omega tilde greater or equal omega, okay, as we want. There's some I in lambda. I want to fix all the things that I have to check. Okay, so all the parameters. So now the probability that sigma I is equal +1, given that sigma j is given by omega tilde j outside I. Let's compute this. So this is given. So the numerator is given by what? So it's the probability that the configuration that you're observing is omega tilde everywhere outside the vertex I, and at I you have a +1. So let me write this like that. It's +1 at I, +1 at I, and omega tilde everywhere else. Okay, I hope the notation is self-explanatory. Okay, I put a +1 at I and omega tilde everywhere else. That's what I get in the numerator here. But it's measure mu tilde. So measure mu tilde, you have also the density G. So it's also G of +1 at I, omega tilde everywhere else. Okay. And then I have to normalize. So when I normalize, the only thing that can change is the value here. It's either +1 or -1, so I have to sum over both possibilities. So I get mu of +1 at I omega tilde, G of +1 at I omega tilde, plus mu of -1 at I omega tilde, G of -1 at I omega tilde. As I said, what you have gained here is that you have a probability measure on one spin, one Bernoulli random variable. So we cannot do much simpler than that. Okay, I'm running out of chalk. Okay, so we are at this stage. This you can write in a bit slightly simpler form. You see, this term in the numerator is the first term in the denominator, so we'd like to cancel both. So it's easier if you take the inverse of all this stuff, and then it's just 1 plus mu of -1 at I omega tilde divided by mu of +1 at I omega tilde G of -1 at I omega tilde divided by G +1 at I omega tilde. Okay. I've not done anything, just divided by the numerator, both in the numerator and denominator, and then I get exactly this expression which is here. Okay. Now I'm going to use what we know. So we're assuming that G is non-decreasing. So this ratio here, you see that the function, the configuration at which I'm evaluating G here and there is the same everywhere except at I, and here it's smaller in the numerator than in the denominator. So that means that the numerator is smaller than the denominator, so this is smaller than 1. Okay, this is smaller than 1. So if I substitute this by 1, I get a lower bound on this conditional probability. So this conditional probability is larger than 1 plus mu of -1 at I omega tilde, mu of +1 at I omega tilde, -1. Okay. That's a lower bound on this conditional probability. And now I started with this conditional probability. I could also have started with this conditional probability. So let's see what we get for this one. So mu of sigma I equal +1, given that sigma j is equal to omega j for all j different from I. And I'm doing exactly the same. So I get, let me directly go to this stage. I will get 1 plus mu of sigma, of -1 at I omega tilde, omega, there is no omega tilde, sorry, omega, divided by mu of +1 at I omega. And that's all, -1. That's all because when we are using mu, the density G does not appear. So this guy is in any case not there when we are computing the corresponding quantity for mu, and omega tilde is replaced by omega. So we get exactly, you see that we get exactly the same expression here and there, except that omega tilde, you have omega tilde here and you have omega there. And what you would like to prove is that this guy here is larger or equal this guy there. So that's the only thing that remains to be proved. Right? If I prove that this object here is bigger than this object there, then I have proved that this conditional probability is bigger than this conditional probability. Okay? But now it's just a matter of looking at how this ratio depends on omega. Okay? And this ratio, we are going to compute it explicitly and see that it's indeed what we want. So mu of the probability of seeing a -1 at I and say omega tilde outside divided by mu of seeing a +1 at I and omega tilde everywhere else. Well, this is just the probability under the Gibbs measure. I mean, mu is essentially the Gibbs measure. Mu is here. Mu is essentially the Gibbs measure. I'm just extending the configuration by the boundary condition. It's essentially the Gibbs measure. And you see that since the configuration coincide everywhere, of course, they have the same boundary condition, but they also have all the same spins outside I. So they coincide everywhere except at vertex I. So everything will cancel in this computation, and the only thing that will remain is exponential of minus 2 beta, sum over all neighbors of I. I is this vertex that where they differ, the two configuration. And then I get the configuration omega tilde extended by eta outside at j, okay? And then minus 2h. It's just an explicit computation using the Hamiltonian of the model. Okay? Just look at the Hamiltonian. The only terms that do not disappear are the terms which see the vertex I. And these are the interaction between the spin at I and the spin in its neighbors, which gives you this sum, and also the magnetic field, which is acting at I. And you see a difference between a minus 1 and a plus 1, it gives you this. Okay, so that's what you get. But that's completely explicit now. Beware that it's not a product, this. Right? It's just a configuration which is equal to omega tilde inside the box and eta outside the box. So this quantity is obviously increasing in omega tilde. So the whole sum is increasing in omega tilde. There is a minus sign, so the whole expression here is decreasing in omega tilde. So this is non-increasing in omega tilde. Okay? Obvious, I mean, just by inspection, you see that it's non-increasing in omega tilde. So in particular, it will be, so let me do it in the correct way. So omega is larger, it's smaller than omega tilde, it's non-increasing, so it will be smaller than mu of minus 1 at I omega divided by mu of plus 1 at I omega. Okay, so we have this inequality, which must be true because omega is smaller than omega tilde. Okay? And the function is non-increasing. Okay? But that means that this guy here is smaller than this guy here, but there is an inverse power here. So I get indeed the inequality in the other direction, and I'm done. I've proved the FKJ inequality. Okay. Good. And with that, we conclude the course. And you will continue to investigate various chosen chapters in statistical mechanics during the second semester during Hugo's class. I don't know what you will do exactly, but he's not going to focus just on the Ising model. He wants to cover many different topics, interesting topics. Okay, so it was nice teaching to you, and good luck for the exam, and have a Merry Christmas.